two men once went up to the temple to pray, and by every outward measure their society used, the verdict on each was already settled before either opened his mouth. One was a Pharisee, a man whose learning and discipline commanded respect wherever he went. The other was a tax collector, a figure so despised that ordinary people kept their distance from him in the street. Anyone watching them enter the temple courts in first-century Jerusalem would have assumed they already knew which man stood near to God and which stood far from him. The parable Jesus told about these two men overturned that assumption completely. For when the prayers were finished, it was the despised man, and not the admired one, who went home accepted by God. This is the story of the Pharisee and the tax collector and the prayer that God heard. Jesus told this parable while he was making his way toward Jerusalem in the long stretch of teaching that Luke gathers into the journey to the city. Crowds moved with him from town to town, some hoping to be healed, others drawn by his teaching, and many still weighing for themselves whether this teacher from Galilee could be the Messiah they had waited for. The Pharisees were rarely far from these crowds. They were a lay movement devoted to the careful keeping of the law, and much of what they stood for was admirable. They knew the scriptures, observed the fasts, and gave themselves to the commandments with a seriousness most of their neighbors never attempted. The danger lay beneath the devotion rather than in it, for a man who measures his obedience against the failures of those around him will almost always come away satisfied with himself. Luke tells us plainly whom Jesus had in view: those which trusted in themselves that they were righteous and despised others. Luke 18:9. The scene he chose would have been instantly familiar to everyone listening because it unfolded in the temple. The temple stood at the center of Jewish worship, the appointed place where sacrifices were offered and prayers ascended morning and evening. Many who came to pray timed their visit to one of the daily hours of prayer, when the lamb was offered on the altar and incense rose in the sanctuary, so that a worshiper's prayer was joined to the sacrifice the priests made on behalf of the whole nation. It is against this background of atonement that Jesus sets his story. Two men went up into the temple to pray. The first was a Pharisee, and those listening would have pictured him at once, a man whose dress and bearing announced his standing and who was recognized on sight as a person of religion and discipline. The second was a tax collector, and here the crowd's reaction would have turned sharply. Tax collectors gathered revenue for Rome, the occupying power, and the system they worked invited abuse, since a collector profited by extracting more than Rome required and keeping the difference for himself. Many had grown wealthy this way, and their neighbors regarded them as collaborators who had sold their own people for Roman coin. By the ordinary reckoning of the day, no one looked more righteous than the Pharisee, and no one more lost than the tax collector, and the parable exists to show how badly that reckoning could fail. The Pharisee took up a position where he could be seen, and he began to pray. His words opened with thanksgiving, which was proper enough. But as the prayer went on, its true center came into view, for he was occupied less with the mercy of God than with the merits of himself. "God, I thank thee," he prayed, "that I am not as other men are, extortioners, unjust, adulterers, or even as this publican." Luke 18:11. Having set himself above sinners in general, he glanced across the court and set himself above one sinner in particular, the tax collector standing at a distance. Then he turned to his record. "I fast twice in the week. I give tithes of all that I possess." Luke 18:12. Each claim was true, and each reached beyond what the law strictly demanded. The law required a single fast in the year on the Day of Atonement, yet the devout had taken to fasting on Mondays and Thursdays, and this man kept both. The law required tithes on certain produce, yet he tithed everything that passed through his hands, careful lest anything escape. The trouble was never that the Pharisee had done these things. The trouble was that he leaned his whole standing before God upon them. His prayer asked for nothing and confessed nothing, because in his own estimate he had nothing to confess. He had come to present an account he was sure would settle in his favor, and the longer he spoke, the more plainly that account exposed the pride beneath it, for pride is never more at home than when it wears the clothing of religion. While the Pharisee prayed near the center of the court, the tax collector remained at the edge of it. He came no closer and made no display, because he understood his situation too well to attempt any defense of himself. The weight of his sins held him where he stood. Luke describes him standing afar off, a man who would not lift up so much as his eyes unto heaven, but smote upon his breast. Luke 18:13. The gesture would have struck the crowd, for beating the breast was a sign of deep grief, rare among men and belonging more to the sharpest moments of mourning. This was not the embarrassment of someone caught in a fault, but the sorrow of one who had finally seen himself as God saw him. His prayer was short and made no attempt to explain or excuse him. He said only, "God be merciful to me, a sinner." Luke 18:13. The plea was richer than it appears in translation, for the word he used reached back to the mercy seat in the sanctuary, the place of atonement where blood was sprinkled for the sins of the people, so that his cry was less a request for general kindness than a plea that God would deal with him through that very sacrifice. And he did not number himself among many sinners. He called himself the sinner as though, standing there, he could think of no other. Those listening would have expected the parable to close in the Pharisee's favor, since he was the man of standing, and the tax collector was the sinner, and surely God would side with the one who kept the rules. Instead, Jesus said of the tax collector that this man went down to his house justified rather than the other. Luke 18:14. It was a startling reversal. To be justified meant to be declared righteous in God's sight, set right with him and received as forgiven. And Jesus assigned that verdict to the very man the crowd had written off. The tax collector walked home reconciled to God, while the Pharisee left in precisely the condition he had entered. The two men were not divided by the fact that one had sinned and the other had not, since both were sinners. They were divided by what each brought to God. One came with his hands full of accomplishments and asked God to ratify them. The other came with empty hands and asked God for mercy, and it was the empty hands that received. Jesus closed the parable with a principle that runs through the whole of Scripture. Everyone that exalteth himself shall be abased, and he that humbleth himself shall be exalted. Luke 18:14. The pattern appears again and again in the biblical story. The same God who raised Joseph from a prison cell to a place of authority and who passed over the obvious candidates to anoint a shepherd boy as king, consistently resists the proud and gives his grace to the lowly. The Pharisee believed he was standing tall in God's presence, and pride had so blinded him that he could not see how far he had fallen. The tax collector believed he had nothing to bring, and that very emptiness placed him exactly where the mercy of God could reach him. The kingdom of God moves in ways that overturn the expectations of those watching it, so that the one who trusts himself comes at last to ruin, while the one who trusts God's mercy finds life. The parable presses an uncomfortable question upon anyone who hears it honestly. It asks whether we measure ourselves against the people around us rather than against the holiness of God, and whether, beneath our gratitude, we quietly assume that our good works have made us acceptable to Him. The Pharisee's failure lay in the pride that had taken root beneath his religion, while the tax collector's hope rested on mercy alone. The same choice stands before every believer. One may rest on his achievements and his reputation, or he may come before God without pretense and confess his need of grace. The prayer God hears is not always the longest or the most carefully worded. Often it is the brief and unguarded cry of a heart that knows it cannot save itself. The Pharisee entered the temple confident in himself, and the tax collector entered broken by his sin. Yet, by the time they left, their positions had been reversed. The proud man remained at a distance from the God he thought he had impressed, while the humble man walked away, forgiven. This is what grace does. The tax collector had not earned his forgiveness and did not deserve it. He received it because he asked for mercy, and God delights to show mercy to those who seek Him with a humble heart. Next time, the journey continues toward Jericho, where a blind beggar at the roadside refuses to be silenced. As the crowd tries to hush him, he cries out all the louder to the Son of David, and his faith changes everything, because the boldest faith is sometimes found in the very person everyone else has overlooked. If God could lift a broken tax collector from guilt into forgiveness, He can do the same for anyone who comes to Him in humility. Just ask the tax collector,